In the frozen wilderness of Alaska, where temperatures drop to minus 40 degrees and visibility becomes 0 in seconds, most people wouldn't last an hour. But Saracen wasn't most people. When a routine training mission turned into a nightmare, and 6 Navy SEALs found themselves trapped in a deadly blizzard, it was a missing woman, presumed dead for 2 days, who would emerge from the white hell to save their lives. This is the true story of how a solo female sharpshooter vanished without a trace, only to reappear when it mattered most. The radio crackled with static before going completely silent. Sarah Chan adjusted her position behind the rocky outcrop, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid Alaskan air. Through her scope, she could see the mock enemy position nearly 800 yards away. The wind was picking up, and the weather forecast had mentioned possible snow, but nothing that would interfere with the training exercise. Sarah had always been different. Growing up in rural Montana, she learned to shoot before she could properly ride a bike. Her father, a former Army Ranger, recognized her natural talent early on. By age 12, she could hit a moving target at 300 yards. By 16, she was out hooding seasoned hunters twice her age. Now, at 28, she held records in precision shooting that most military snipers could only dream of achieving. The invitation to participate in this joint training exercise with Navy SEAL Team 7 had come as a surprise. Sarah worked as an independent contractor, specializing in long-range precision training for various military units. Her reputation preceded her, but working with the SEALs was different. These were the elite of the elite, and she knew they were skeptical about having a civilian, especially a woman, involved in their operations. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison had made his feelings clear during the briefing the night before. A tall, weathered man in his mid-30s with steel-gray eyes, Morrison had 20 years of military experience under his belt. He commanded respect from his men, but Sarah could sense his discomfort with her presence. "Ma'am, I appreciate your credentials," Morrison had said, his voice polite but firm. "But this isn't a shooting competition. This is combat simulation. My men's lives depend on precision and teamwork. We can't afford any variables." Sarah had simply nodded, understanding his concern. She'd heard it all before. The doubt, the skepticism, the barely concealed belief that she didn't belong in their world. But she also knew that actions spoke louder than words, and tomorrow's exercise would give her the chance to prove herself. The training scenario was complex. Sarah would provide overwatch and long-range support, while Morrison's 6-man team conducted a rescue mission in hostile territory. The exercise would test their ability to work together under pressure, combining her precision shooting skills with her tactical expertise. As dawn broke over the Alaskan wilderness, Sarah had positioned herself on a ridge overlooking the valley where the mock rescue would take place. The terrain was challenging, rocky outcrops, dense patches of evergreen trees, and steep slopes that could prove treacherous in bad weather. Perfect training ground for real-world scenarios. Her equipment was top-notch. A custom-built .338 Lapua Magnum rifle, specially modified for extreme cold weather conditions. High-end optics that could maintain clarity even in harsh conditions. Specialized ammunition designed to perform consistently in sub-zero temperatures. Every piece of gear had been tested and proven in similar environments. The SEAL team was approaching their insertion point when Sarah noticed the first signs of trouble. The wind was increasing rapidly, and the temperature was dropping faster than the weather reports had predicted. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, moving toward them with alarming speed. Through her radio, she could hear Morrison coordinating with his team. Petty Officer First Class Danny Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, was reporting decreased visibility. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Mike Thompson was monitoring the team's physical condition as they moved through increasingly difficult terrain. The other team members, Petty Officers Jackson, Williams, and Carter, were maintaining their positions but struggling with the worsening conditions. "Overwatch, this is Alpha 1. Morrison's voice came through clearly despite the static. Weather's deteriorating faster than expected. What's your status? Sarah keyed her radio. Alpha 1, Overwatch. I have clear sight lines on your approach route, but I'm seeing a major storm system moving in from the northwest. Estimate 15 minutes before it hits your position. Copy that, Overwatch. We'll accelerate the timeline. But nature had other plans. The storm hit with the fury that only an Alaskan blizzard could bring. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nearly zero. The wind howled across the valley, carrying snow that stung like needles and made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Sarah's position on the ridge gave her a slightly better view, but even she was struggling to maintain visual contact with the SEAL team. Through brief breaks in the swirling snow, she could see them taking shelter behind a cluster of boulders about halfway to their objective. Alpha 1, Overwatch, she transmitted. Recommend you abort the exercise and return to base camp. This storm is beyond safe training parameters. Morrison's response was immediate. Negative, Overwatch. Real operations don't stop for bad weather. We adapt and overcome. Sarah understood his reasoning, but she also understood the deadly nature of Alaskan weather. She'd grown up in harsh conditions, but this storm was rapidly becoming life-threatening. The temperature was plummeting, and the wind was strong enough to knock a person off their feet. Alpha 1, I'm reading wind speeds over 60 miles per hour. Temperature dropping to minus 35. You need to find better shelter. We're moving to the tree line, Morrison replied. Continue mission. That was the last transmission Sarah received from the SEAL team. She tried multiple times to raise them on the radio, adjusting frequencies and checking her equipment. Nothing but static. The storm had either damaged their communications gear or was interfering with the radio waves to such an extent that contact was impossible. From her elevated position, Sarah could barely make out the area where she'd last seen the team. The blizzard was a white wall of fury, and even with her advanced optics, she couldn't penetrate the swirling snow. She was effectively blind. The logical thing to do would be to return to base camp and report the situation. The SEALs were trained professionals who could take care of themselves. They had survival gear, emergency beacons, and the skills to weather the storm. But something in her gut told her that this situation was different. Sarah had spent enough time in wilderness conditions to recognize when nature was showing its true power. This wasn't just a bad storm. It was the kind of weather that killed experienced outdoorsmen who made simple mistakes or found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. She made a decision that would later be questioned by investigators and military officials. Instead of returning to safety, Sarah gathered her gear and began making her way down from the ridge toward the last known position of the SEAL team. The descent was treacherous. The wind threatened to knock her off balance with every step, and the blowing snow made it impossible to see potential hazards like loose rocks or hidden crevices. Her rifle case was strapped securely to her back, and she carried a pack with emergency survival gear. But moving through the storm was like trying to navigate through a frozen hell. Every few minutes, she would stop and try to raise the SEAL team on her radio. Each attempt met with the same result. Nothing but static and the howling of the wind. The storm seemed to be intensifying rather than passing through, which meant that anyone caught in the open was in serious danger. Sarah's training kicked in as she made her way through the blizzard. She'd learned wilderness survival from her father and had spent countless hours in harsh conditions, but this was testing every skill she'd ever acquired. Navigation was nearly impossible, so she relied on her compass and her instincts, moving carefully from one landmark to another. The cold was brutal. Despite her specialized gear, she could feel it seeping through her layers of clothing. Her face mask was collecting ice from her breath, and her fingers were starting to lose feeling despite her insulated gloves. She knew that she was pushing the limits of what was safe, but something drove her forward. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, Sarah found evidence that the SEAL team had been in the area. Footprints in the snow, partially filled but still visible, indicated that multiple people had passed through. The tracks were heading toward a dense stand of evergreen trees that would provide some shelter from the wind. Following the tracks, Sarah pushed deeper into the forest. The trees provided some protection from the worst of the wind, but the snow was still falling heavily, and visibility remained severely limited. She continued to call out on her radio, hoping for any response that would indicate the team's location. Then, she heard it, a faint sound that might have been a human voice, barely audible over the storm. Sarah stopped and listened intently, trying to determine the direction. There was again definitely human, and it sounded like someone calling for help. Moving toward the sound, Sarah found herself at the edge of a small clearing. Through the swirling snow, she could make out what looked like a depression in the ground, possibly a natural hollow or small ravine that the team had used for shelter. The voices were coming from that direction. As she got closer, the situation became clear. The SEAL team had taken shelter in what appeared to be a natural depression, probably formed by erosion over many years. It provided some protection from the wind, but it was also acting like a trap, collecting snow that was rapidly building up around them. Sarah could see movement in the depression and could hear voices more clearly now. Someone was definitely in distress, and it sounded like there might be an injury. She tried her radio again, hoping that the shorter distance would allow communication, but still got nothing but static. Making her way to the edge of the depression, Sarah called out, "SEAL team, this is Overwatch. Can you hear me?" The response was immediate. "Overwatch. Thank God. We're down here." Sarah carefully made her way down into the depression, using her rifle as a support to prevent herself from slipping. What she found was a situation that was rapidly becoming critical. The six-man SEAL team was huddled together in the limited shelter, but it was clear that they were in serious trouble. Morrison was conscious, but appeared to be suffering from the early stages of hypothermia. Rodriguez had suffered what looked like a broken leg when the team had slipped on ice while seeking shelter. The other team members were in various stages of cold-related distress. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked, kneeling down next to Morrison. "Rodriguez fell about an hour ago," Morrison replied, his speech slightly slurred from the cold. "Possible fracture. Radio's dead. Took damage when we were moving through the rocks. Thompson's been treating him, but we need to get out of here. This depression is filling up with snow." Sarah looked around and immediately understood the problem. While the depression provided shelter from the wind, it was acting like a natural snow collector. If the storm continued, they could literally be buried alive. "Emergency beacons?" she asked. "Tried them," Petty Officer Williams replied. "Storm's interfering with the signal. We're on our own until this weather clears." Sarah assessed the situation quickly. 6 men, one with a serious injury, trapped in deteriorating conditions with limited shelter and no communication with base camp. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and their current position was becoming more dangerous by the hour. "We need to move," she said firmly. "This spot will be our grave if we stay here." Morrison looked at her through eyes that were starting to show the glassy appearance of hypothermia. "Rodriguez can't walk. We're not leaving him." "I'm not suggesting we leave anyone," Sarah replied. "But we need to find better shelter, and we need to do it soon." She pulled out her map and compass, studying the terrain features. There was an old mining cabin marked on the map, about 2 miles to the southeast. It would be a difficult journey in the current conditions, especially with an injured man, but it might be their only chance. "There's a cabin southeast of here," she said, showing Morrison the map. 2 miles. It's marked as abandoned, but it should provide better shelter than this. 2 miles in this storm, with Rodriguez injured. Morrison shook his head. "That's a death march. Staying here is a death sentence," Sarah replied bluntly. "This depression will fill with snow in a few hours. We'll suffocate before we freeze." The SEAL team leader looked around at his men, then back at Sarah. She could see him weighing the options, none of which were good. It was the kind of decision that separated good leaders from great ones, choosing between two dangerous alternatives and taking responsibility for the consequences. "Thompson, what's your assessment of Rodriguez?" Morrison asked. The corpsman looked up from where he'd been monitoring the injured man. "Definite fracture, probably tibia and fibula. I've stabilized it as much as possible, but he needs medical attention. Moving him won't make the injury worse, but it'll be painful." Rodriguez, despite his pain, managed to speak up. "I can make it, sir. Whatever it takes." Morrison nodded slowly. "All right, Overwatch. You know this terrain better than we do. Lead the way." Sarah began organizing the movement. She had Thompson create an improvised stretcher using their gear, while she studied the route they'd need to take. The compass bearing was straightforward, but navigating in the blizzard would require constant attention to direction and distance. "We move as a unit," she instructed. "Stay within arm's reach of each other. I'll take point with the compass. Morrison, you're behind me, then Thompson with Rodriguez on the stretcher. Williams and Jackson take the sides, Carter brings up the rear. If anyone loses contact, stop and call out immediately." The team gathered their gear and prepared for what they all knew would be one of the most dangerous movements they'd ever attempted. The storm was still raging with full fury, and the temperature continued to drop. Moving through the blizzard would expose them to the full force of the elements, but staying would eventually prove fatal. As they prepared to leave their makeshift shelter, Sarah took a moment to study each man's condition. All were showing signs of cold stress, but they were still functional. Morrison's leadership was keeping them focused despite the hypothermia that was clearly affecting him. The team's training and conditioning were evident in how they organized themselves and prepared for the movement. "Remember," Sarah said as they prepared to move out, "we're not just trying to survive, we're trying to get everyone home alive. Stay together, stay focused, and we'll make it." With that, she led the way out of the depression and into the full fury of the Alaskan blizzard. Behind her, 6 Navy SEALs followed, trusting their lives to a woman they'd barely known for 24 hours in conditions that would test every bit of training and determination they possessed. The journey to the cabin would prove to be just the beginning of their ordeal. What happened next would test not only their survival skills, but also their ability to work together as a team when everything was on the line. Sarah's reputation as a sharpshooter was about to be overshadowed by her performance as a leader in one of the most challenging rescue situations any of them had ever faced. As they disappeared into the swirling white darkness of the storm, none of them knew that this was just the first chapter of a survival story that would become legendary among military circles. The woman who had vanished into the blizzard was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge when the stakes are highest. The journey through the blizzard became a test of human endurance that pushed each member of the group beyond their limits. Sarah led the way, checking her compass every few steps while fighting against wind gusts that threatened to knock her off her feet. The snow was falling so heavily that it seemed like walking through a wall of white static. Behind her, Morrison struggled to maintain his footing while helping to guide the makeshift stretcher carrying Rodriguez. The injured SEAL gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to slow down the group despite the agony of movement over rough terrain. Thompson and Williams worked together to keep the stretcher as stable as possible, while Jackson and Carter provided security and watched for hazards that might threaten the group. Progress was agonizingly slow. What should have been a 2-hour hike in normal conditions was stretching into a marathon of survival. Every 100 yards required careful navigation and constant attention to the group's cohesion. The cold was becoming a serious enemy, sapping strength and clouding judgment with each passing minute. After the first hour of movement, Sarah called for a brief halt. The group huddled together while she checked their position and assessed everyone's condition. Morrison's hypothermia was worsening, His speech was becoming more slurred, and his movements were less coordinated. Thompson was showing signs of exhaustion from helping carry Rodriguez. The other team members were holding up better, but everyone was being affected by the extreme conditions. "How much further?" Morrison asked, his words slightly garbled by the cold. Sarah checked her compass and tried to estimate their progress. "Maybe halfway. We're making good time considering the conditions, but we need to watch for signs of severe hypothermia." "How's everyone feeling?" The responses were stoic but honest. Everyone was cold, tired, and pushed to their limits, but no one was ready to quit. Rodriguez, despite his broken leg, was maintaining good spirits and encouraging the others. His positive attitude was helping to keep morale up during the grueling journey. "Sir, I can walk for a while," Rodriguez offered. "Give the others a break from carrying the stretcher." "Negative," Thompson replied firmly. "That fracture needs to stay immobilized. We keep carrying you." Sarah made a decision that would prove crucial to their survival. "We're going to change formation. Morrison, you're starting to show serious signs of hypothermia. I want you in the middle of the group where you'll be more protected from the wind. Carter, you take point with me. We'll share navigation duties." Morrison started to protest, but Sarah cut him off. "This isn't about rank or ego. It's about getting everyone home alive. You're no good to your team if you collapse from hypothermia." The SEAL commander recognized the wisdom in her words and grudgingly agreed to the formation change. Carter moved up to join Sarah at point, while Morrison took a position in the middle of the group where he would be partially sheltered from the worst of the wind. They resumed their movement through the storm, with Sarah and Carter alternating between checking the compass and watching for obstacles. The terrain was becoming more difficult as they climbed toward the higher elevations where the cabin was located. Rocky outcrops hidden by snow created hazardous footing, and several times team members slipped or stumbled in the treacherous conditions. The wind was relentless, creating a wind chill factor that made the already dangerous temperature even more lethal. Sarah's face mask was completely covered with ice from her breath, forcing her to periodically remove it to clear her vision. Her hands were becoming numb despite her insulated gloves, making it increasingly difficult to operate her compass accurately. During the second hour of travel, they encountered their first major obstacle. A steep slope that would normally be manageable became nearly impossible to negotiate while carrying an injured man on a stretcher. The snow was deep and unstable, and the angle was too steep to maintain proper footing. Sarah studied the obstacle while the team took shelter behind a cluster of pine trees. The slope extended for about 50 yards and was necessary to reach the plateau where the cabin was located. Going around would add at least an hour to their journey, time they didn't have given the deteriorating condition of several team members. "We're going to have to find a way up," she told the group. "Going around will take too long, and I'm not sure Morrison can handle another hour in these conditions." Carter studied the slope and came up with a solution. "We can use our gear to create a pulley system, tie ropes together, and haul the stretcher up while the rest of us climb alongside." It was a risky plan that would require perfect coordination, but it was their best option. The team quickly organized their ropes and gear, creating an improvised pulley system that would allow them to haul Rodriguez up the slope while the rest of the team climbed. The ascent was terrifying. Each team member had to focus completely on their footing while maintaining their grip on the rope system. Rodriguez was bounced and jostled despite their best efforts to keep the stretcher stable, but he endured the pain without complaint. Morrison, despite his hypothermia, managed to contribute to the effort through sheer determination and willpower. Near the top of the slope, disaster almost struck. Williams lost his footing on a patch of ice and started to slide backward. His weight on the rope system threatened to pull the stretcher and Rodriguez down with him. Carter, showing the quick reflexes that had made him a SEAL, managed to grab Williams and stop his slide, but The incident highlighted just how precarious their situation had become. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, all 7 members of the group reached the top of the slope. They were exhausted, cold, and pushed to their absolute limits, but they had overcome the obstacle. Sarah checked her compass again and estimated that they were now within half a mile of the cabin. The final stretch of the journey proved to be the most challenging yet. The plateau was exposed to the full fury of the wind, which was now gusting over 70 miles per hour. The team had to link themselves together with rope to prevent anyone from being separated in the whiteout conditions. Progress slowed to a crawl as they fought against the elements. Morrison's condition was becoming critical. He was showing advanced signs of hypothermia, confusion, slurred speech, and uncoordinated movements. Thompson was monitoring him closely, but they all knew that if they didn't find shelter soon, the team leader might not survive. Sarah was also feeling the effects of the extreme conditions, but her experience in harsh environments gave her an advantage. She had learned from her father how to pace herself during long exposure to cold, how to maintain body heat through controlled movement, and how to recognize the early warning signs of hypothermia and frostbite. As they struggled across the plateau, Sarah began to worry that they might have missed the cabin in the blizzard. The visibility was so poor that they could easily walk past their destination without seeing it. She decided to adjust their search pattern, moving in a zigzag formation that would increase their chances of spotting the structure. The decision proved to be crucial. After another 15 minutes of careful searching, Carter spotted a dark shape through the swirling snow. "Structure ahead," he called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. The sight of the cabin was like seeing a mirage in the desert. It represented salvation, warmth, and safety in the middle of the frozen wilderness. The team quickened their pace as much as their exhaustion would allow, desperate to reach shelter before any of them collapsed from the cold. The cabin was old and weathered, but appeared to be structurally sound. It was a single-story log building with a steep roof designed to shed snow. The windows were boarded up, and the door was secured with a heavy padlock, but these were minor obstacles compared to what they had already overcome. Carter and Jackson worked together to break open the door while the others took shelter on the leeward side of the building. The lock was frozen solid, but a few well-placed kicks with their heavy boots broke it free. The door swung open, revealing a dark interior that looked like paradise compared to the storm outside. One by one, the team members entered the cabin, with Thompson and Williams carefully maneuvering Rodriguez's stretcher through the doorway. Sarah was the last to enter, taking a moment to secure the door behind them and block out the howling wind. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark, but it was dry and provided complete protection from the wind. Sarah used her flashlight to survey the interior while the team settled Rodriguez on a makeshift bed created from their gear. The cabin was sparsely furnished, but had the basic necessities for survival: a wood-burning stove, a supply of seasoned firewood, and even some emergency supplies left by previous visitors. Thompson immediately went to work treating Rodriguez's injury, while Sarah and Carter focused on getting a fire started in the stove. The old chimney drew properly, and soon they had a warm fire burning, providing both heat and light for the small space. The warmth of the fire seemed to breathe life back into the exhausted team. Morrison's condition began to improve as his body temperature rose, and his speech became clearer. Rodriguez was given pain medication from Thompson's medical kit and seemed to be resting more comfortably. As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah took stock of their situation. They had successfully reached shelter and were no longer in immediate danger of freezing to death. However, they were still cut off from base camp with no way to communicate their location. Rodriguez needed proper medical attention for his broken leg, and several team members were suffering from mild frostbite. "How long do you think this storm will last?" Morrison asked, his speech now clear as his body warmed. Sarah looked out through a gap in the boarded windows at the still raging blizzard. "Hard to say. These Alaskan storms can last anywhere from a few hours to several days. We need to prepare for the possibility that we might be here for a while. The team began organizing their limited supplies and gear to make the most of their resources. They had enough food for perhaps 2 days if they rationed carefully. Water wouldn't be a problem. They could melt snow, but they would need to conserve their fuel and ammunition in case they had to signal for rescue or defend themselves from wildlife. As the evening wore on, the team members took turns monitoring the fire and caring for Rodriguez. The warmth and shelter allowed them to rest and recover from their ordeal, but everyone understood that their situation was still precarious. They were missing from their scheduled check-in, and a search and rescue operation would likely be launched once the storm passed. Sarah found herself thinking about the decisions that had led them to this point. If she had returned to base camp when the storm first hit, would the SEAL team have been able to survive on their own? Her choice to leave her safe position and help them had probably saved their lives, but it had also put her own life at risk. Morrison seemed to be reading her thoughts. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming after us. We wouldn't have made it without you." "That's what teammates do," Sarah replied. "Look out for each other." It was a simple statement, but it carried profound meaning. In the span of a few hours, the skeptical SEAL commander and the civilian contractor had become true partners, bound together by shared danger and mutual trust. As the night deepened and the storm continued to rage outside, the 7 survivors settled in for what might be a long wait. They were alive, they were together, and they had shelter. For the moment, that was enough. But their ordeal was far from over. The storm was just the beginning of a series of challenges that would test not only their survival skills, but also their ability to work as a team when everything was on the line. And somewhere out there in the frozen wilderness, a search and rescue operation was about to begin that would write another chapter in the legend of the woman who disappeared into the storm to save 6 Navy SEALs. The fire crackled in the old stove, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls as the wind howled outside. 7 people who had been strangers just days before were now bound together by an experience that would change their lives forever. The sharpshooter who had earned their respect through marksmanship was now proving her worth in an entirely different arena, one where courage, leadership, and determination mattered more than accuracy with a rifle. Outside, the search teams were organizing for what would become one of the most challenging rescue operations in Alaskan military history. But inside the cabin, 7 people were learning that survival isn't just about enduring hardship. It's about doing whatever it takes to make sure everyone makes it home. Dawn brought little relief from the storm that continued to batter the small cabin. Sarah woke to the sound of wind still howling through the trees and snow pelting against the boarded windows. The fire had died down to glowing embers during the night, and the cabin's interior had grown cold again. She quietly added wood to the stove, careful not to wake the others who were still sleeping. Rodriguez was resting as comfortably as possible given his circumstances. Thompson had done an excellent job stabilizing the broken leg, and the pain medication was helping the injured SEAL manage his discomfort. Morrison looked much better after a night's rest in the warm cabin. His color had returned to normal, and the dangerous signs of hypothermia had disappeared. As the team members gradually woke up, Sarah began planning for the day ahead. The storm was still raging, making any attempt to travel extremely dangerous. However, she knew that search and rescue teams would be looking for them as soon as the weather allowed, and they needed to be prepared to signal their location. "What's our ammunition situation?" she asked Morrison as they shared a simple breakfast of military rations. "Limited," he replied. "We got maybe 50 rounds between all of us." "Why?" "Signal shots," Sarah explained. "When the storm breaks, we'll need to let the search teams know where we are. 3 shots fired in succession is the universal distress signal." Carter was studying the cabin's construction and had made an interesting discovery. "There's a radio antenna connection on the roof," he announced. "Looks like whoever built this place had some kind of communication setup." Sarah and Morrison examined the connection and found that it was indeed designed for a radio antenna. The cabin had obviously been used as some kind of remote monitoring station or research outpost at some point. More importantly, they found a box of emergency supplies that included flares, emergency food, and even a basic first aid kit. "This changes things," Morrison said. "If we can get a signal out, we won't have to wait for someone to find us." The problem was that none of their radio equipment was designed to work with the antenna system, and the storm was still interfering with any electronic communications. They would need to wait for better weather before attempting to establish contact with the outside world. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to notice changes in the storm pattern. The wind was still strong, but the gusts seemed less frequent. The snow was still falling, but not as heavily as it had been during the night. She had spent enough time in harsh weather to recognize the signs that a storm system was beginning to move through. "I think we might see improvement by this afternoon," she told the team. "The storm's starting to break up." Her prediction proved accurate. By early afternoon, the wind had died down significantly, and occasional breaks in the snow allowed glimpses of the surrounding terrain. It was still far from safe traveling weather, but it was an improvement that gave everyone hope. Rodriguez had developed a slight fever during the day, which concerned Thompson. The corpsman suspected that infection might be setting in at the fracture site, despite his efforts to keep the wound clean and properly dressed. The injured SEAL needed proper medical attention, and soon. "We need to get him to a hospital," Thompson told Morrison privately. "I can keep him stable for another day or two, maybe, but without proper treatment, this could become life-threatening." Morrison nodded grimly. They all understood that time was becoming a critical factor. Even if the weather improved enough to allow travel, getting Rodriguez to medical care would be extremely difficult given the remote location and harsh conditions. Sarah had been monitoring the weather from her position by the window and made a decision that would prove crucial to their rescue. "I'm going to try to establish visual contact with any search aircraft," she announced. "If there are helicopters or planes looking for us, I need to be in a position where I can signal them." "That's too dangerous," Morrison protested. "The weather's still marginal, and you could get lost or injured out there." "I know this terrain," Sarah replied confidently. "There's a rocky outcrop about half a mile north of here that would give me a clear view of the valley. If I can get there and establish a signaling position, I can guide rescue teams directly to us." Morrison looked around at his team, weighing the risks and benefits of Sarah's proposal. Rodriguez needed medical attention urgently, and waiting for rescue teams to find them could take days. On the other hand, sending someone out in the still dangerous weather was a significant risk. "I'll go with you," Carter volunteered. "No," Sarah said firmly. "One person moving through this weather is hard enough to manage. Two people would be more likely to get separated or lost. Besides, you're needed here to help take care of Rodriguez." After considerable discussion, Morrison reluctantly agreed to let Sarah attempt to reach the signaling position. She would take emergency supplies, a radio, and flares, and would check in every hour. If she didn't make contact within 4 hours, the team would assume she was in trouble and would attempt a rescue. Sarah prepared carefully for the journey. She took her rifle, which could be used for signaling as well as protection, along with extra ammunition. Her pack contained emergency food, water, additional clothing, and the precious flares that would be essential for attracting the attention of search aircraft. The weather outside was still challenging, but manageable for someone with Sarah's experience. The wind had died down to perhaps 20 miles per hour, and the snow was now falling intermittently rather than in the constant blizzard of the previous day. Visibility had improved to about 100 yards, which was a significant improvement over the near-zero conditions they had endured. The half-mile journey to the rocky outcrop took Sarah nearly an hour to complete. The snow was deep in places, sometimes reaching her waist, and the terrain was treacherous with hidden obstacles and unstable footing. But her wilderness experience served her well, and she was able to navigate safely to her destination. The rocky outcrop proved to be an excellent observation post. It rose about 50 feet above the surrounding forest and provided a clear view of the valley and the approaches that rescue aircraft would likely use. Sarah established a sheltered position among the rocks where she would be protected from the wind, but still able to signal in multiple directions. Her first radio check with the cabin was successful, confirming that she was in position and that the team was doing well. Rodriguez was stable, and Morrison was organizing the others to prepare for a possible rescue attempt. Sarah settled in to wait and watch. She knew that search and rescue operations would likely begin as soon as the weather allowed, and military helicopters would be equipped to operate in marginal conditions if the mission was urgent enough. Her job was to be ready to guide them to the cabin as soon as they appeared. The wait stretched into the late afternoon before Sarah heard the first sound of aircraft engines in the distance. Through the swirling clouds, she could see the distinctive shape of military helicopters approaching from the southeast. There were two of them, flying in formation and obviously conducting a systematic search of the area. Sarah immediately began signaling with her emergency flares, firing them high into the air where they would be visible from a great distance. The bright red flares arced through the gray sky like miniature fireworks, creating unmistakable signals that could only come from humans in distress. The helicopters altered their course toward her position, and she could see them beginning a careful approach. The weather was still marginal for helicopter operations, but the pilots were obviously skilled and experienced in difficult conditions. Through her radio, Sarah coordinated with the cabin team to prepare for rescue. Morrison organized his men to assist with Rodriguez's evacuation, while Thompson prepared medical information that would be needed by the rescue teams. The first helicopter managed to land in a small clearing about 200 yards from Sarah's position. A team of pararescuemen, known as PJs, immediately began moving toward her location while the helicopter maintained a hover pattern, ready to take off again if the weather deteriorated. "Are you Sarah Chun?" the lead PJ called out as he approached her position. "Yes. I've got 6 Navy SEALs in a cabin about half a mile south of here. One has a broken leg and needs immediate medical attention." The PJ quickly assessed the situation and began coordinating with both helicopters. The second aircraft would attempt to land near the cabin, while the first would evacuate Sarah and provide aerial coordination for the rescue operation. The evacuation of the SEAL team proved to be complex and dangerous. The helicopter had to make multiple approaches to the cabin area before finding a suitable landing zone. The weather was still challenging, with gusting winds that made the aircraft difficult to control during the critical phases of landing and takeoff. Rodriguez was evacuated first, with Thompson accompanying him to continue medical care during the flight. The injured SEAL was conscious and alert, managing to give Sarah a thumbs-up signal as he was loaded into the helicopter. His positive attitude had remained unchanged throughout the entire ordeal. Morrison and the remaining team members were evacuated in the second lift. As the SEAL commander was helped into the aircraft, he paused to speak with Sarah. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice clear despite the noise of the helicopter engines. "When this started, I had doubts about working with a civilian. You've proven me wrong in every way possible. You save our lives out there." "We saved each other," Sarah replied simply. "That's what teams do." The flight back to base camp was relatively short, but it gave everyone a chance to begin processing what they had just experienced. Sarah found herself sitting next to Williams, one of the younger SEALs who had performed exceptionally well during the ordeal. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Williams said over the noise of the helicopter. "Of course. When you made the decision to come after us in that storm, weren't you scared?" Sarah thought about the question carefully before answering. "Terrified," she said honestly, "but fear is just information. It tells you that something is dangerous, but it doesn't have to control your decisions. The question isn't whether you're scared. It's what you do despite being scared. The helicopter landed at the base camp to a crowd of military personnel and medical staff who had been anxiously waiting for news of the missing team. Rodriguez was immediately transported to the base hospital, where X-rays confirmed Thompson's field diagnosis of a compound fracture that would require surgery. Over the following hours, Sarah found herself the center of attention from military investigators, medical personnel, and eventually news media who had gotten word of the dramatic rescue. The story of a civilian contractor who had risked her own life to save a SEAL team was exactly the kind of human interest story that captured public imagination. But Sarah was more interested in checking on the welfare of the men she had helped rescue. She visited Rodriguez in the hospital, where he was recovering from surgery to repair his broken leg. The operation had been successful, and doctors expected him to make a full recovery. "The docs say I'll be back on duty in 6 months," Rodriguez told her, managing a smile despite his obvious discomfort. "First thing I want to do when I'm cleared is buy you dinner. Best damn meal money can buy." Morrison visited Sarah before she left the base to return home. The SEAL commander looked rested and had completely recovered from his hypothermia experience, but she could see that the events had affected him profoundly. "I've been thinking about what happened out there," he said. "About leadership, about teamwork, about what it really means to have someone's back. You taught us all something important." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "That the best leaders aren't necessarily the ones with the highest rank or the most experience. They're the ones who do what needs to be done when it needs to be done, regardless of the personal cost." Morrison extended his hand. "If you're ever interested in a permanent position working with military units, I'll personally recommend you for any assignment you want. What you did out there, that's the kind of leadership we need more of." Sarah shook his hand, honored by the offer, but knowing that her path lay elsewhere. She was a civilian who had found herself in an extraordinary situation, not someone looking to change careers. But the experience had changed her in ways she was still beginning to understand. The official investigation into the incident concluded that Sarah's actions had directly prevented what would have been a multiple casualty situation. Her decision to leave her safe position to assist the SEAL team, her leadership during the movement to the cabin, and her successful coordination of the rescue operation were all cited as examples of exceptional heroism. The awards and recognition that followed meant less to Sarah than the letters she received from the wives and families of the SEAL team members. These personal messages of gratitude from people who understood that their loved ones had come home because of her actions were more meaningful than any official ceremony. 6 months later, Sarah received an invitation to Rodriguez's wedding. The SEAL had met his fiancée during his recovery, and he wanted Sarah to be there for the happiest day of his life, just as she had been there during one of his most difficult. At the wedding reception, Sarah found herself surrounded by the entire SEAL team and their families. These men who had started as skeptical strangers had become lifelong friends, bound together by an experience that had tested them all and proven their worth. Morrison raised a toast to Sarah during the reception, to the woman who disappeared into a blizzard and came back with 6 lives in her hands, to the sharpshooter who proved that the most important target isn't always the one in your scope. Sometimes it's the people who need your help. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but Sarah was more interested in the quiet moments of conversation with people who had shared something extraordinary. These were the real rewards of what had happened in the Alaskan wilderness. The knowledge that when it mattered most, she had been able to make a difference. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the experience, she would always emphasize that it wasn't a story about individual heroism. It was a story about what people could accomplish when they worked together, supported each other, and refused to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. The woman who had disappeared into the storm had returned with more than just 6 rescued lives. She had returned with a deeper understanding of leadership, courage, and the bonds that form between people who face adversity together. And In the end, that was the most valuable prize of all. The story became legend within military circles, told and retold as an example of what was possible when skill, courage, and determination combined with genuine care for others. But for Sarah Chun, it would always be remembered not as a moment of individual glory, but as a time when 7 strangers became a family, united by their shared determination to make sure everyone made it home.